Welcome to Made with Manasi. So today quickly we'll be looking at the ascending and descending tracts in neurophysiology. So I'll be giving you brief tips. Remember, I'll be using the outside inside principle. Okay, so we'll start by understanding things from an overview point of view. Then from there now we'll dive deeper into those specific topics. So we'll be looking at the ascending and the descending tracts. So quickly, I want us to look at the terminologies that we'll be focusing on as we dive deeper into this topic. So in order for you to understand the ascending and descending tracts, there are basic terminologies that you have to know about. Terminology such as neuron, what a neuron is, of which is just a nerve cell that transmits impulses. So what a nerve is basically a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system. Remember, when you look at the neuron, the structure of a neuron, on a neuron you find dendrites, you find the cell body and the axon. And in the axon, of which we know that's where even action potentials are initiated. Okay, that's where action potential travel, then initiated from the axon hillock. So a nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system. So axons of a neuron in the peripheral nervous system make up a nerve. Then a bundle of axons in the central nervous system makes up what? A tract, or makes up tracts. So in the spinal cord, we have axons that run up, ascending. We call them tracts because they are bundles of axons that are moving up, carrying different different types of information. So we have other terms such as modalities. So what are modalities? Modalities are just basically types of sensations. So we'll take time to dive deeper. The time we'll be doing sensory system, but for this one, this is just basically an overview on the tracts. So but it is important for us to understand what modalities are. So modalities are just basically types of sensations such as pain, touch, temperature, all those are just types of sensations. So you see that we'll get to use these terms in our discussion today. So you see terms such as decussation. So what's a decussation? A decussation is just basically a crossing of nerve fibers to the opposite side. So once nerve fibers cross, that is referred to as a decussation. Okay, then a termination where a nerve fiber ends. So we'll be looking at these things when we look at the tracts. We have tracts where they decussate, meaning where the fibers cross, where they terminate, where the fibers end, such as for the descending tracts. Then another term is proprioception. So proprioception is basically the sense of body position and movement. So let me not take time on those things. So quickly, here is a diagram of the spinal cord. I had added this diagram for us to be able to understand the structure of the internal spinal cord. This is important because most of the terms here that are labeled on this spinal cord are usually involved in the tracts. Okay, remember these tracts are running in the spinal cord. So on the spinal cord, remember we have horns. There is the posterior horn, also known as the dorsal horn, then the ventral horn, also known as the anterior horn. Okay, and on the posterior horn, that's where the sensory fibers enter from. Okay, then the anterior horn or ventral horn, that's where the motor fibers are coming from. Okay, then now another thing that I have to make mention is the funiculars. So the funiculars are basically more like columns that are found in the spinal cord. These are very important in understanding the tracts, because we'll be able to understand which and what type of tracts are affected based on the funiculars or the column that we're talking about of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord basically has 3 columns which are referred to as funiculars. You have the anterior, the lateral, and the posterior. So these are important. Let's take note of these things. Okay, so finally the overview of the ascending and the descending tracts. So the ascending tracts are also referred to as sensory tracts. Why? Because they carry sensory impulses. Okay, so the ascending tracts or axons that are running up the spinal cord in the spinal cord are basically part of the sensory system. Okay, what are they doing? They carry information from the body to the brain. Okay, they're carrying information from the body to the brain, and the main modalities that we find here, or the types of sensations that we find here, is touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. Basically things that are involved in the sensory system. Let's take note of that. So there are two main types of tracts here. We have ascending and the descending one. So we're having tracts that are going up the spinal cord to the brain, from the body to the brain, and these are referred to as what? Ascending tracts, and these are part of the sensory. Remember, sensory does what? Carries impulses from the receptors to the central nervous system. Okay, so the other type of tracts is the descending tracts. The descending tracts are part of the motor system. The descending tracts are coming from the brain, meaning they are carrying commands from the brain to the body. Remember, when we're talking about the reflex activity, we discussed that we're having fibers that are carrying information from the receptors to the central nervous system for integration. Then after integration or processing is done, there has to be a response from the body to the effector organs. So the descending system basically just describes fibers that are under the motor system, carrying commands from the brain to the body. And what do? They control movement, tone, and posture. So here's a table trying to just describe the various types of tracts that are found in each category of the main tracts. Okay, so we said there are two main types of tracts. There is the ascending and the descending. So in the ascending tracts, we have three major tracts. We have the dorsal column, also known as the DCML, the dorsal column lemniscus, medial lemniscus, DCML. Then in the dorsal column, that's where we find the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. So we'll dive deeper into explaining these things. But the dorsal column is referred to as one tract. Then another tract is the spinothalamic tract, which is further subdivided into the anterior and the lateral spinothalamic tracts. Then we also have the spinocerebellar tracts. Okay, so dive deeper into breaking this down so that we even know the modalities that they carry. So under the descending or the motor tracts, we have two types of tracts there. There is the extrapyramidal and the pyramidal. Under the pyramidal, we have the corticospinal tract and corticobulbar tract. Then under the extrapyramidal, we have the rubrospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, vestibular tract, and the tectospinal tract. So it is very important to understand this overview here, because it gives you a picture of which fibers that are ascending in the spinal cord and which fibers are descending. Okay, so starting with ascending tracts, remember ascending tracts are carrying information or sensory information from the body to the brain. So this gives you a picture of the spinal cord and where some of these tracts are located. So remember, I said the spinal cord can be separated into funiculars. Okay, so these funiculars are just more like columns where these tracts run. Okay, and this diagram is showing us the ascending tracts specifically. So remember, in the ascending tracts, we have what? We have the dorsal column, medial lemniscus, the spinal tract, and the what? And the spinocerebellar tract, which have been demonstrated here. Okay, so the DCML pathway has two subdivisions. It has the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, which are both found on the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord. And the gracilis is more medial as compared to the what? The cuneatus. Okay. Then another tract there that we mentioned, we said the spinothalamic. So the spinothalamic, as you can see labeled here, the spinothalamic is found both on the lateral and the anterior. So we have the lateral spinothalamic and the anterior spinothalamic. That is why it is also sometimes known as the anterolateral spinothalamic, because it contains both the lateral and spinothalamic tracts. Okay. Then we have the posterior and the anterior spinocerebellar tract. So this is basically an overview of these tracts. So now dive deeper into understanding what these tracts carry. Okay, so we start with the DCML, also known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus. So the dorsal column lemniscus, remember, this is part of what? The ascending tracts, meaning they are carrying sensory information. And where are they going? They are moving from the brain going up to the what? They are moving from the body going up to the brain. So this is the fine sensation pathway, and it carries what? Fine touch, vibration, and proprioception. So these are the three main modalities of the dorsal column lemniscus. Let's take note of that. Okay, so how is the pathway for this? Okay, how is the pathway for the DCML? So remember, the DCML has two components. It has the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. Okay, so fasciculus gracilis carries it carries these modalities that we've mentioned, which is fine touch, vibration, and proprioception. From where? From the lower body, which is the lower extremities. Then the cuneatus is the one that carries from the upper body. So an easier way of trying to remember these things. So fasciculus gracilis, from grass. Okay, that indicates that it comes from where? From the lower body. So it is carrying those modalities, the fine touch, it is carrying vibration and proprioception. From where? From the lower body or the lower extremities. Okay, so in knowing the pathway, you have to master three things. There are three order neurons that are involved. There is the first order neuron, the second order neuron, and the third order neuron. Okay, so taking note of the two components that the DCML has. In the first order neuron is running from the receptors, whereby once the sensory information comes from the receptors, it goes to the what? Dorsal root ganglion. And remember, the dorsal root ganglion enters to where? To the dorsal root, to the dorsal horn. Okay, then from there now it ascends. So this is the first order neuron from the receptors, dorsal root ganglion, to which then ascends where? Ascends in the, so as it is ascending, remember, there are two components, there are two fibers that are coming from the gracilis and from the cuneatus. From the gracilis, they are coming from the lower body. Okay, that is that is fine touch, that is vibration coming from the lower body. Then we're having fine touch and vibration that is coming from where? From the upper body. So once it ascends ipsilaterally. Okay, to ascend ipsilaterally means to ascend on the same side. Okay, supposed to indicate this on the terminologies. Contralaterally, opposite side. Ipsilaterally, on the same side. So remember, the DCML ascends ipsilaterally. In the what? There are two components there. There are two columns there that are part of the DCML. Okay, so the dorsal column, remember, it is subdivided into two, and the most medial is the gracilis, with the cuneatus being lateral. Okay, so the most medial one, which is the gracilis, is the one that is carrying those modalities from the lower body. Then from there, once the first order moves from the receptors, the dorsal root, then ascends ipsilaterally in these two columns, what happens? It will synapse in the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. So fibers ascending in the fasciculus gracilis, where are they going to synapse? Nucleus gracilis. Okay, First class cuneatus fibers, where are they going to synapse? They synapse in the nucleus cuneatus. So this is basically an overview of what is happening. And where are they synapsing? In the medulla. So in the medulla, that's where we find the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Okay, then from there now we have the second order neuron. Once they synapse on the nucleus, we move on to the second order neuron. From the second order neuron, they now cross, or they now decussate. Remember the term decussation, that's just crossing of fibers. So these fibers now do what? Decussate in the medulla. Okay, so once they decussate in the medulla into the internal arcuate, forming the internal arcuate fibers, then they will form what? The medial lemniscus. From the medial lemniscus, then they ascend to where? To the relay center, which is what? The thalamus, specifically the VPL. Okay, then from there now, third motor neuron. So from the nucleus now is the third motor neuron, which moves from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. And remember, the primary somatosensory cortex is found where? It is found in the frontal lobe. Okay, that's why we find the primary somatosensory cortex in the frontal lobe, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, in the post central gyrus. So this is just an example showing, this is a diagram that is just demonstrating the fibers that the order neurons that we have here and how they ascend. Remember, the whole were moving from the receptors, dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion then ascends ipsilaterally, where in which columns? The nucleus cuneatus and nucleus what? Nuclear in the funiculus gracilis, funiculus cuneatus. Then they ascend just like that. Then from there now they'll go and synapse on the nucleus. Which nucleus? In the medulla, specifically nucleus cuneatus for fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis, nucleus gracilis, just like that. Then from there now ascend to the thalamus. From the thalamus then it goes to the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, then from there now, these are key things that we have to note about the DCML. Remember, it ascends ipsilaterally at which level? Level 1 and 2. Okay, level 1 and 2. So lesions in the spinal cord are usually what? Ipsilateral. So it causes ipsilateral loss. Ipsilateral loss of what? Those modalities. Ipsilateral loss of vibration, fine touch. Okay, vibration, ipsilateral loss of vibration, fine touch, the modalities of DCML. Okay, once there is a lesion, once there is damage to the spinal cord, modalities of the DCML will be affected ipsilaterally. So meaning, if the damage is on the left, the part of the body that is affected is the left side of the body. Okay, if the lesion is above the medulla, they need to be contralateral. Why is it being contralateral? Remember, the decussation or crossing of fibers in the medulla, the crossing of fibers in the DCML pathway happens where? In the medulla. So meaning, if there is a lesion above the medulla after the decussation, what will happen is contralateral, meaning damage to the right side will produce what? Contralateral loss, meaning on the opposite side of the body. Alright, so we move on to the spinothalamic tract. Remember, there's the DCML and the spinothalamic tract. Okay, in the spinothalamic tract, also known as the anterolateral system, spinothalamic tract carries which modalities? It's the one that carries the pain and temperature pathway, and these are the modalities that it carries: pain, temperature, and crude touch. How is the pathway now? So this one is a bit unique from the DCML, because the first order neuron enters the spinal cord and synapses almost immediately. Okay, then the second order neuron crosses within 1 to 2 levels. So sorry, I made a mistake on the other one. 1 or 2 levels is under the spinothalamic tract, so it crosses within 1 or 2 levels. Remember, the DCML was just ascending ipsilaterally. This one, upon synapsing, almost immediately does what? It crosses. Okay, so meaning any damage, any lesion in the spinal cord, if it happens on the left, it will produce what? Ipsilateral. If it is above the level 1-2 levels, it will produce what? Contralateral. Okay, signs. So it ascends contralaterally, goes to the thalamus, then to the cortex, just like that. So this is an easy way of understanding these pathways. Know the order neurons, the first order, second order, and third. Just forgot to put the third order neuron here as well. Okay, so lesion here, as mentioned, they produce what? Contralateral loss. Okay, a few levels below the lesion. So the other tract is the spinocerebellar tract. Okay, so the spinocerebellar tract is responsible for which modality? The unconscious proprioception. Unconscious proprioception, what is happening there? This carries what? Muscle and joint position of what? Joint position to the cerebellum. Okay, remember proprioception, we said position, knowing the body position. Okay, so now this is unconscious proprioception. Unconscious proprioception is a modality of the spinocerebellar tracts. And remember, there are 2 types there, as demonstrated in the diagram that we saw there. There is an anterior spinocerebellar and what? And posterior. Key things to know here is that they both the anterior has no decussation. The posterior has no decussation, but the anterior has decussation, but it decussates twice. Okay, so it crosses twice, making the lesions becoming more ipsilateral again, because it crosses once, becoming contralateral, then crosses again, becoming ipsilateral again. Okay, then the spinocerebellar function now. Remember, the spinocerebellar is carrying what? Unconscious proprioception, so coordination of movement. So what happens if there is a lesion? There is ataxia and coordination problem. Okay, difficulties in movement, difficulties in coordination. So the lesions are usually ipsilateral as well. Okay, so spinocerebellar DCML usually ipsilateral, unless if it is above. So this one does not decussate except for the anterior, which decussates twice and cancels out, becomes ipsilateral. But the other one now decussates, the spinothalamic ascends contralateral. So we move on now to the descending tracts. So this descending tracts now, remember, descending tracts has 2. There is the pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. So why are they called so? So the pyramidal tracts originate from the cerebral cortex. Take note of that. Whilst the extrapyramidal tracts will originate from the what? Brainstem what? Nuclei. So there are tracts that are passing through the medullary pyramids and those that do not pass through the medullary pyramids. Those that pass through the medullary pyramids are the ones that are referred to as the what? Pyramidal tracts. Okay, then those that do not pass through the medullary pyramids are referred to as what? Extrapyramidal. So key thing to note here is that the extrapyramidal, they do what? They are responsible for voluntary and skilled movement. Okay, then extrapyramidal are responsible for control. They are responsible for controlling pressure, for controlling posture, tone, balance, and autonomic movements. Okay, so remember the pyramidal tracts, we mentioned that we have the corticospinal and the corticobulbar. Corticobulbar, corticospinal. Those are the 2 main tracts that are found in the pyramidal, meaning where are they passing? They are passing through the pyramidal medullary pyramids. Okay, this is how I love remembering these things, and it is very easy to remember them this way. You have to know the origin, the decussation, the termination, and the function. These four things. So this is how we'll look at each tract that is found in the descending. We'll look at its origin, the decussation, the termination, where the fibers end, then its function now. Okay? You remember here we're not carrying modalities, but it's a response to the effector organs, which are specifically the muscles. Okay? So the origin for the corticospinal tract is the what? The primary motor cortex, which is found where? The precentral gyrus. Remember, the primary somatosensory cortex is found where? In the postcentral gyrus. Okay? Then the decussation now. The corticospinal tract has the anterior and the lateral. Okay? The lateral corticospinal tract is the one that does what? That crosses at the medulla, and it is about 85 to 90% that crosses at the medulla. Okay, so it decussates at the medulla, specifically the lateral corticospinal tract. So there are two tracts there of the corticospinal tract. There's the lateral and the anterior. The lateral will decussate about 85 to 90%. Then the rest, which is 15 or 10%, will remain what? Ipsilateral. Okay, it will remain ipsilateral, then it will go down, then cross at the what? At the spinal level and not at the medulla. Then from there on, where does it terminate? It terminates in the anterior horn cells of the what? Of the spinal cord. Okay, so once these tracts move like this, what's their function? What functions are they carrying out? They're the ones that are responsible for voluntary movement of the body and fine skilled movements. That's key. So remember, the pyramidal, which is the corticobulbar, corticospinal, they are responsible for what? Voluntary and skilled movement. Okay, that is why the corticospinal tract is one that is responsible for voluntary movement of the body and fine skilled movement. That's corticospinal tract. Lesion to this one, experience paralysis, okay, and weakness. Corticobulbar now. Corticobulbar origin, although different from the corticospinal originates from where? Primary motor cortex. This one is from where? The primary motor cortex. So they are not that different, but this one is coming from specifically mainly focused on from the face region. Okay, then decussation. This is usually mostly bilateral innervation. Okay, some nuclei mainly contralateral. So here we have the cranial nerves that are involved here. So we have cranial nerve number 5, cranial nerve number 7, 9, 10, 11, 12 that are involved here, because this is where this tract terminates. Okay, so once it terminates on these cranial nerves, you'll be able to know the function of this, because we're having the trigeminal here, we have the facial nerve, we have the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory, and the what? The hypoglossal. Obviously, if it terminates there, what will be the function? Movement of what? The trigeminal is involved there, movement of the jaw. The face is involved there. Remember, facial muscles. So we're having the facial nerve there. Then the glossopharyngeal, the pharynx, the larynx. Then we have the what? The hypoglossal for the tongue. So the fact that it terminates, so corticobulbar, remember, the fact that it terminates on these cranial nerves, specifically the trigeminal, the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, just know that its function will be involved in what? Movement of the face, the jaw, the tongue, the pharynx, and the larynx. Okay. Then the rubrospinal now, rubro for red, origin is from the red nucleus. Okay. Then why is the red nucleus located? It is found in the brainstem. Yes, in the brainstem, specifically in the midbrain. So why does its decussation occur? Okay, crosses immediately in the what? In the brainstem, in the midbrain. Then its termination is other interneurons, then to the anterior horn, mainly the cervical. So the anterior horns that are found where? In the cervical horn. Remember this part of the spinal cord. Then what's its function? Cervical. If it's the cervical that is involved mainly, what will it be facilitating? It will be facilitating flexor muscles of what? The upper limbs. Cervical, that's where it's terminating. So where it terminates also tells you about its function. Remember, the cortical bulba terminates where? On the motor nuclei of cranial nerves, those, meaning it will help in movement of what? The specific target organs or target muscles that cranial nerve terminates on. Then from there now, we move on to the vestibular tract. So the vestibular tract origin is from the vestibular nuclei, which is located where? Pons and medulla. Decussation mostly and cross, it descends what? Epilaterally. Then anterior horns. This is where it goes where? To the extensors. Okay. Then its function will be to maintain balance, vestibular balance and posture. Then facilitates the extensor tone. Okay. So the reticulospinal tract now, origin, reticular formation found where? In the pons and the medulla. Then decussation both crossed and uncrossed. Okay. Then the termination now in the neurons anterior horns. Function is to regulate muscle tone. Reticular formation, muscle tone, then controls the reflex activity and influences autonomic movements. Then lastly but not the least, we have the tectospinal tract. Tectospinal tract originates from the word superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is found where? In the midbrain. Decussation crosses in the midbrain, termination cervical spinal cord. So where it terminates tells you its function. Okay, its function will be to where? Cervical, there is coordination of what? The head and eye movement. Reflex to what? To visual stimuli. So once there's a stimuli, you are able to turn your eyes towards that visual or auditory response due to the tectospinal tract. What is the takeaway message from this? So a quick summary is that the pyramidal are involved in what? Voluntary movement. That's why the cortical bulba terminates on those motor nuclei, and it will tell you of that function. The corticospinal, skilled and fine movement. Okay. Then the extrapyramidal is responsible for what? For posture, tone, and reflexes. So thank you very much. This is the last part that was included there that I thought was important. Are the clinical correlates of what? The major tracts. So the clinical correlates of the major tracts comes as a result of you understanding how the fibers ascend. Okay. So like involvement of the DCML, a lesion will lead to what? Loss of those modalities that we mentioned, that is fine touch, vibration, and proprioception. So loss of those particular modalities, they tell you what is involved. Remember, the moment you just mention modalities, just know that you're dealing with sensory. If there is disturbance in movement, posture, tone, and all those things, just know that you're dealing with descending. Okay. So modalities are mainly involved in what? In sensory. That's why we're finding fine touch. That's why we're finding vibration. So a clue there, once you just see modalities, just know you're dealing with ascending fibers. Then shift your focus on ascending fibers. We're having DCML, we're having spinothalamic and spinocerebellar. Then loss of fine touch, vibration, and proprioception. Remember, those are for what? The DCML. Okay. Then what will be the signs? There will be sensory ataxia and positive Romberg sign. Okay. The deficit will be what? Ipsilateral. Remember how it ascends? It ascends ipsilaterally. Okay, before decussation. So if it happens before the decussation is in the medulla. So if the lesion is at the spinal cord level, what will happen? It will produce ipsilateral signs. Okay, unless if it happens above the decussation, then it will produce contralateral. Remember the DCML crosses in the medulla. Then the spinothalamic tract. So the spinothalamic tract, its modalities, once affected, it will produce loss of what? Pain and temperature. This one usually produces what? Contralateral, because remember, starts from 1 to 2 levels. Then once it enters the spinal tract, what does it do? It ascends contralateral. So lesion in the spinal cord usually produces what? Contralateral effects. Okay, because it is crossing just after entering the spinal cord. The corticospinal tract, remember, weakness and paralysis. So this is movement, deficits in movement. There's weakness, there's paralysis there. What will it produce now? Upper motor neuron, what? The upper motor neuron signs such as spasticity, hyperreflexia, and Babinski signs. So these are usually seen in lesions that are involved with the corticospinal tract. Contralateral deficit above what? The decussation. Ipsilateral below the decussation. Then spinocerebellar tract, lesion, ataxia, and uncoordinated what? Movement. Remember, these ones are usually what? Ipsilateral. Then there is a classic syndrome example, which is Brown-Sequard syndrome. Brown-Sequard syndrome, where there is hemisection of the spinal cord, usually produces ipsilateral loss of what? Motor, meaning the DCML is also involved there, and the contralateral loss of pain, meaning there is involvement of the spinothalamic tract. Otherwise, thank you very much for paying attention. Thank you for your patience.